We hear the term narcissist thrown around a lot these days. It's that word people use to describe an ex who wouldn't listen, a boss who never gave credit, or even that friend who somehow made every conversation about themselves. And while sure, we all have moments of self-absorption because we're human, there's a big difference between that and what we're talking about today. True narcissism goes deeper. It's not just about arrogance or selfishness. It's about a fundamental inability or unwillingness to see beyond oneself. A narcissist isn't just someone with a big ego. They operate from a place of deep insecurity, but they mask it with confidence, charm, and sometimes even generosity, at least at first. It's like they're always curating an image, a version of themselves they want the world to see. But here's the thing, behind that polished facade, there's a rigid, fragile core that cannot handle criticism, accountability, or vulnerability. And that's where things get tricky, because if you ever challenge that image, if you ever hold up a mirror and say, hey, something doesn't feel right here, you'll see just how quickly the mask cracks. Now, most of us were raised to believe that when we're in conflict with someone, the healthy thing to do is to communicate, explain how we feel, listen to the other person's perspective, and work toward understanding. But with a narcissist, that's where the rules change, because a real relationship, one built on trust, mutual respect, and emotional safety, requires two things that narcissists struggle with: accountability and empathy. And if you've ever tried to have a real honest conversation with someone like this, you probably walked away feeling like you just got hit by an emotional freight train. Maybe you started off trying to address something small, just a simple, hey, I felt hurt when you said that, or I need to talk about something that's been bothering me. And instead of being met with understanding, suddenly you're defending yourself, apologizing, or questioning whether you even have the right to feel the way you do. It's a masterclass in deflection. They might dismiss your feelings outright. You're overreacting. They might flip the script. I can't believe you're making this about you when I'm the one who's been stressed. Or they might launch into a personal attack. You're so sensitive, no one else would have a problem with this. And let me tell you, if you've ever walked away from a conversation like that feeling small, confused, or just drained to your core, you are not crazy. That's what it feels like to be in the orbit of someone who cannot, will not take a real honest look at themselves. And the hardest part, it doesn't always start this way. In fact, narcissists can be incredibly charming. They know how to make you feel special, seen, valued, until you stop playing by their rules, until you start asking for something deeper. Because at the end of the day, a narcissist's biggest fear isn't being disliked, it's being exposed. It's having to sit in the discomfort of someone else's truth when it doesn't serve their version of reality. They avoid this at all costs, which is why they gaslight, deflect, and manipulate. It's why they make you question yourself instead of ever having to question themselves. And this is where we start to understand why a single well-placed question can unravel everything. Because when you ask the right question, one that forces them to step outside their own experience and truly consider yours, you're not just starting a conversation, you're challenging the very thing they work hardest to protect. Here's where things get interesting, because if you've ever dealt with a narcissist, you know that calling them out directly doesn't usually work. You could sit across from them with a stack of undeniable facts, a calm voice, and the best of intentions, and you still wouldn't get anywhere. And if you've tried, you've probably learned pretty quickly that the more directly you challenge them, the more tangled the conversation becomes. It's like stepping into quicksand. The harder you fight to be understood, the deeper you sink. And that's because narcissists aren't wired for accountability the way most people are. When a healthy person is confronted with something difficult, maybe they hurt someone, made a mistake, or got called out for something, they might feel uncomfortable, sure. No one loves being wrong. But there's usually a moment where they take a breath and say, okay, I hear you. Maybe they still feel defensive, maybe it stings a little, but there's an openness, a willingness to engage in that messy, necessary work of understanding another person's experience. That's empathy, that's growth. But a narcissist experiences that same moment as a threat. And that's because their entire self-pitch is built like a house of cards. It's not rooted in real confidence or self-awareness. It's built on this fragile scaffolding of control, of carefully curated perceptions, of an unshakable belief that they are special, different, and most importantly, never wrong. And when you press against that, even slightly, you're not just asking them to reflect, you're threatening to topple the entire structure, so they react accordingly. And this is why direct confrontation rarely works, because the moment they feel that structure wobbling, their only goal is to shut you down. They'll twist your words, they'll rewrite history, they'll turn the conversation into something so exhausting, so convoluted that eventually you just give up. And that's the point. They're not interested in resolving anything. They're interested in control. But here's the good news. You don't have to fight them on their terms. You don't have to exhaust yourself trying to prove something they will never accept. Instead, you can take a different approach, one that shifts the power dynamic entirely. See, the mistake we make is thinking that if we just explain ourselves the right way, if we just find the perfect combination of words, they'll finally get it. But the reality is it's not about how well we explain, it's about how much they are willing to engage. And narcissists are experts at keeping that engagement one-sided. They'll talk circles around you for hours, but they won't pause long enough to really consider what you're saying, because that would require them to step outside themselves, to sit in the discomfort of someone else's reality, and that is something they simply do not do. And that's where the right question changes everything, because the right question doesn't just ask for a response, it forces them into a position they don't know how to navigate. It interrupts their usual patterns. It takes the control away from them and places it squarely in your hands. And when you ask it, you'll see something fascinating happen. You'll see hesitation, you'll see defensiveness, you'll see them scramble for an answer that isn't just about them. And that moment is where the truth starts to slip through the cracks. There's a moment in every conversation with a narcissist where you realize something isn't quite right. You're talking, you're explaining, maybe even making a really solid, well-reasoned point, and yet somehow you feel like you're getting nowhere. It's like standing in front of a mirror that reflects only what the other person wants you to see. And the more you try to bring reality into the conversation, the more distorted everything becomes. This is where most people get stuck. They think, if I can just phrase it differently, if I can just get them to see my perspective, we'll get somewhere. But that moment never comes, because it's not about clarity, it's not about logic, it's about control. And when someone's priority is maintaining control over the conversation rather than engaging in it, the rules change. But here's where things get interesting. There's one way, one powerful way to shift the dynamic entirely. One question that forces them into unfamiliar territory, a place where they can't rely on their usual tactics to avoid responsibility, dodge accountability, or flip the script. And that question is this: what do you think I feel about this situation? It's simple, it's direct, and it does something narcissists hate. It forces them to step outside of themselves. Because here's the thing, narcissists are experts at talking about themselves. They can monologue for hours about how something affects them, how they feel, how they've been wronged, but ask them to reflect on how you feel, ask them to acknowledge your perspective. That's where they falter. Now, a healthy person, even if they're defensive, even if they don't fully agree with you, will at least try. They might say, I think you feel heard, or I think you're frustrated because you don't feel heard, because that's what people with empathy do. They take a moment to consider someone else's experience. But a narcissist will do anything but answer that question honestly, because to answer it, they have to acknowledge that your feelings exist as something separate from their own, and that's dangerous territory for them. That's why when you ask this question, you'll often see them do one of a few things. They might avoid answering altogether, brushing past it like you never even asked. They might deflect. Why does it always have to be about feelings with you? They might turn it back on you. Well, what do you think I feel? Or they might get defensive, irritated, even angry, as if you just asked them the most ridiculous, unreasonable thing in the world. And that reaction, that moment of scrambling, that moment of resistance, that's your answer. That's the moment you see the truth, because for someone who truly cares about you, even in the heat of an argument, even when they're upset, acknowledging your feelings isn't a threat. But for a narcissist, it is, because their entire way of relating to the world depends on everything revolving around them. And this question, it's the one thing they don't prepare for. There's this moment that happens when you ask a narcissist the right question. It's subtle, but if you're paying attention, you'll catch it. It's the hesitation, the slight shift in their expression, the flicker of something unspoken just behind their eyes. And then almost immediately, it's gone, replaced by whatever defense mechanism kicks in first. Because the second you ask them to step outside of their own experience, to consider something from your perspective, you've pushed them into unfamiliar, uncomfortable territory. Most people, when confronted with this kind of question, what do you think I feel about this situation, might take a second, maybe look inward for a moment, and then try to answer honestly. Even if they're defensive, even if they disagree with you, they'll at least acknowledge the question. But a narcissist doesn't play by those rules. And that's where things start to get interesting. Because once you ask this question, you're going to see something happen. They're not going to engage with it the way a healthy person would. Instead, they'll react in a way that tells you everything you need to know. Some will avoid answering altogether. They'll pretend they didn't hear you or steer the conversation in a completely different direction. You'll say, what do you think I feel about this? And suddenly they're talking about something you did 2 months ago, something completely unrelated, something meant to put you on the defensive instead. Because if they can make you question yourself, they don't have to answer the question. Others will minimize the entire conversation. They'll roll their eyes, sigh, act like you're making a big deal out of nothing. I don't know. Why do you always have to be so emotional? They'll dismiss you, make you feel like you're the problem for even asking, because to them, your feelings are not something they need to consider. They don't want to step outside of themselves, and they certainly don't want to acknowledge that you have an emotional world separate from their own. And then there are the ones who turn the question back on you. Instead of answering, they'll say, well, what do you think I feel? Or why does it always have to be about you? Suddenly the focus is back on them. It's a tactic, a way of shifting the power in the conversation so that you're the one scrambling, explaining, trying to prove yourself again. And if you fall for it, if you take the bait, you're right back where they want you, spinning in circles, trying to get them to care, trying to be understood. But the most telling reaction, the one that exposes them the most, is anger. Because when a narcissist feels cornered, when they feel like they can't manipulate or deflect, they lash out. They get irritated, they accuse you of starting a fight, of being dramatic, of ruining the moment. They push back hard because deep down, they know they can't answer honestly without giving something away. And that's the last thing they want to do, because answering honestly, truly engaging with your question would mean acknowledging your experience. It would mean admitting that your feelings exist independent of their own. And for someone who thrives on control, on keeping the focus entirely on themselves, that is a threat. That is something they cannot allow. And that's why this question works, because no matter how they respond, they reveal themselves. If they avoid, dismiss, deflect, or attack, they are showing you exactly who they are. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The real test of any relationship isn't how people behave when things are easy. It's how they show up when things are hard. It's in those messy, uncomfortable moments where someone has the opportunity to lean in and say, I hear you, and I care about what you're feeling, or to shut down, deflect, and make it about anything but accountability. And that's what makes this question, what do you think I feel about this situation, so powerful? Because when you ask it, you don't just expose a narcissist, you also see with crystal clarity how a healthy person would respond. And that contrast, it's everything. Because a healthy person, even if they're upset, even if they don't fully agree with your perspective, will still pause. They will take a second, let the question land, and try to engage with it honestly. They might say, I think you feel hurt, or I think you feel frustrated that I wasn't listening. And here's the key. They won't just stop there. They'll follow it up with something like, is that right? Or help me understand, because that's what empathy looks like. It's not about getting it perfect. It's not about always knowing exactly how someone feels. It's about making the effort to step outside of your own experience long enough to say, your feelings matter to me. Let's talk about them. And when someone does that, when they make space for your emotions, even in the middle of their own, something shifts. You feel seen, you feel valued, you feel like you're not just talking at someone, but with someone. And that's what real connection is built on. Not perfection, not getting everything right all the time, but the willingness to sit in the discomfort of another person's experience and honor it, even when it's hard. Now, that doesn't mean that every emotionally healthy person will have a perfect response every time. We're all human. We all get defensive sometimes. We all have moments where we don't show up the way we should. But the difference is a healthy person, even in their worst moments, will eventually come back to the table. They'll say, I'm sorry, I wasn't really listening before, or I got defensive, but I do want to understand. They will make the effort. Because when someone truly values you, when they truly care about the relationship, they don't just care about how they feel, they care about how you feel too. And that's what makes this question such a game changer, because when you ask it, you're not just testing for narcissism, you're testing for emotional maturity, for self-awareness, for a willingness to engage in the kind of conversations that build real trust, real intimacy, real connection. And once you see the difference, once you experience what it feels like to be in a relationship where your feelings are acknowledged and respected, it becomes that much harder to settle for anything less. There's something incredibly powerful about clarity. The moment you recognize what's really happening in a conversation, in a relationship, in a dynamic you've been struggling with for far too long, it changes things. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And when you ask the right question, when you push past the distractions and force a moment of truth, that clarity comes fast. You realize that this person you've been trying so hard to connect with, to be understood by, was never playing by the same rules. And that truth, it's freeing, but it also comes with a responsibility, because knowing what you're dealing with is only part of the equation. The next part, the harder part, is figuring out what to do with that knowledge. And that's where we have to be careful, because the instinct, especially if you've been stuck in this dynamic for a long time, is to keep trying, to keep asking the question in different ways, to keep hoping that maybe, just maybe this time they'll get it. And that's understandable, because when you care about someone, you want to believe they are capable of change. You want to believe that if you just find the right words, the right approach, the right moment, something will click. But here's the truth. If someone has spent years, maybe even their entire life, avoiding accountability, shutting down conversations that make them uncomfortable, and dismissing other people's emotions, they are not going to suddenly wake up one day and say, you know what? You're right. I see everything clearly now. That's not how this works, because change, real lasting change, requires self-awareness. It requires a willingness to sit in discomfort, to be wrong, to own up to the ways we've hurt others. And if someone isn't capable of doing that, no amount of effort on your part is going to force them into it. And that's where boundaries come in. That's where you get to decide what you will and won't tolerate. Because once you have this information, once you see how someone reacts to the simplest, most human request for empathy, you can no longer pretend you don't know. You can no longer lie to yourself and say, maybe they just didn't understand. No, they understood. They understood and still chose not to engage. So the question becomes, what are you going to do with that knowledge? For some people, that means stepping away entirely, creating distance, understanding that no matter how much you care, you cannot fix someone who doesn't see themselves as a problem. For others, especially if the narcissist in question is a family member, a coworker, or someone you can't fully cut out of your life, it means changing the way you engage. It means not expecting emotional depth from someone who has spent their entire life avoiding it. It means recognizing the limits of what this person is capable of and refusing to keep setting yourself up for disappointment. And that's hard. It's hard to accept that someone you love, someone you maybe once believed in, isn't capable of giving you the kind of connection you deserve. But it's also one of the most powerful things you can do, because once you stop looking for water in a dry well, once you stop expecting something from someone who has shown you time and time again that they cannot give it, you free yourself. You take back all the energy you've been pouring into someone else's black hole of self-absorption, and you redirect it back where it belongs, on yourself. And that's the real takeaway here. This isn't just about exposing a narcissist. It's about reclaiming your time, your energy, your emotional well-being. It's about recognizing that you deserve to be in relationships where your feelings aren't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged, where you don't have to fight to be understood, where the people in your life don't just tolerate your emotions, they honor them. So if you ask this question and get an answer that makes it clear you're dealing with someone who refuses to see you, believe them, believe what they're showing you, and then make the choice, the hard but necessary choice, to stop seeking validation from someone who is never going to give it. Because the moment you do that, that's the moment you take your power back.